Hello and welcome to the 24th Annual Get Lit Festival. I'm Kate Peterson, Director of Get Lit Programs, a nonprofit organization housed within Eastern Washington University. Our program is responsible for Get Lit, Washington State's longest running annual literary festival, which hosts readings, writing workshops, craft classes, panel discussions, and much more. This year, we're excited to be hosting in-person events taking place this Thursday through Sunday, April 21st through 24th, in many venues across downtown Spokane. And of course, we're very happy to be back with you in this virtual space as well. You can find a full schedule of in-person and virtual events, along with information about all of our festival authors by visiting our website, getlitfestival.org. Now I'd like to welcome Luke Leinberger, Get Lit's Assistant Coordinator, who will introduce today's event.
Thanks, Kate. Today, I would like to welcome you to a reading and conversation with two talented local writers and Eastern Washington University alums who have books recently published or forthcoming in 2022. Kacy Tellessen is a Marine Corps veteran whose memoir, Freaks of a Feather, looks at his experience serving in Iraq. Leyna Krow's first novel, Fire Season, which is coming this summer from Viking, tells the story of three scheming opportunists whose lives collide in the wake of a devastating fire in Spokane Falls in 1889. Following their readings, Leyna and Kacy will talk with Kate and I about their experience at EWU and how it shaped their writing careers. We'll go ahead and get the reading started with Kacy. Kacy was born in Spokane and raised in Sinkhole, Washington, a small farming community that clings to the edge of the Palouse. Kacy joined the Marine Corps Infantry directly out of high school and deployed twice to Iraq as an infantry machine gunner with the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines, from 2005 through 2009. After coming home, he attended Eastern Washington University, where he studied creative writing. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Zero Dark 30 Literary Journal, The War Horse, Leatherneck Magazine, as well as the Soft Fleet website. Please welcome Kacy.
Thank you. So this piece I'm going to be reading is called Going, and this is when I first get to Iraq. The city of Haditha in the Alumni province of Iraq sits beside the fabled and ancient Euphrates River. Since the inception of civilization, humans have been living and fighting next to these waters. Upriver from the city sits Iraq's largest hydroelectric dam. Built in collaboration with the Soviets in the early 1980s, the dam is vital to Iraq's overtaxed infrastructure. The Soviet-inspired gray concrete heights of the Haditha Dam created the artificial lake Kacy. Seen from the International Space Station, the lake looks like an ancient serpent in the middle of digesting some fierce barbed prey. As the inlets from the artificially swollen water shoot out in every imaginable direction, it is a fitting analogy, as the artificial lake swallowed one of the oldest archaeological sites in Iraq, a 43-century-old village named after the ancient virgin war goddess Anat. It would seem in 2006, the war goddess was alive and well, spewing forth her poison from the Red Army-built concrete structure. The Haditha Dam makes the northernmost point of the Haditha Triad, or the Triangle of Death, the more dramatic. It consists of 3 municipalities of Haditha, Barwana, and Alumni. All 3 of the cities were built off the bank of the Euphrates, giving their streets a steep incline as they rise from those ancient waters. Alumni herself rests on the west side of the river, rising all the way to the top of the desert plateau. On one block, there are towering 3-story stucco structures, marble floors and guest houses. And on the next block are half-built stucco structures where families squat in absolute filth. Open sewer trenches flow down the steep city streets, carrying the population's refuse towards the gentle current of the Euphrates. Garbage litters the streets. The inhabitants employ an out-of-sight, out-of-mind policy with their garbage, dumping their refuse over the high stucco walls that surround the courtyards of their homes. The houses themselves seem built for war. Almost all the houses are at least 2 stories, and all have roof access with adequate cover and concealment for rooftop snipers. Each house is surrounded by a high stucco fence, some upwards of 7 feet tall. And a logical pattern of alleyways and small side streets twists through the city, making navigation almost impossible for the uninitiated. After the invasion in 2003, the roads lost their Iraqi names. The American forces renamed the streets after Major League Baseball teams and American landmarks. Like the formerly cursed Boston Red Sox, Route Red Sox was constantly plagued with misfortunes. Most of these misfortunes came in the way of improvised explosive devices. The IED was Iraq's biggest and most ominous killer. The insurgent fighter had become experts in cobbling together old munitions and household goods, turning them into powerful bombs with biblical implications. Explosives scraped out of old Russian artillery shells were the explosive of choice. They created IEDs that were meant to maim, only taking off a heel or a toe, maybe a whole leg, in order to cause chaos on the battlefield. These were often mixed with well-coordinated ambushes. Other IEDs were built with the destructive capacity to liquefy humans and twist metal like demonic origami. The main drag that runs all the way from Haditha to Haklania was named after that game-ending piece of blue real estate from the Monopoly game, Boardwalk. Boardwalk ran alongside the lush palm groves that bordered the city and bordered the river, offering the area's farmers an oasis to grow dates and graze their goats. The farming culture of the area had endured centuries of war with scattered generations of peace. Stone structures built off the water tell of the Roman occupation of antiquity. The farmers survived the invading Mongols who rode like death on a sea of horses. They survived British rule. They survived the brutality of Saddam. They would survive the Americans as well. It's 8,388 miles as the crow flies from the Marine Corps base, Hawaii to Haklania. But the giant metal birds of today rarely fly like their crow forefathers. Our plane had to fly to Alaska, 2,777 miles, and then across the wide and icy expanse of northern Canada, where almost nothing can survive, to Germany, another 4,448 miles. While on board, we were given prepackaged meals of chicken or beef by good-looking blonde flight attendants. They looked like clones in their matching blue skirts as they went up and down the aisle, making sure rifles and machine guns were in their upright and locked positions. The airplane stopped in Germany for the amount of time it takes a Marine to smoke 6 cigarettes. With more smiles and performances on what to do if the plane crashes, our middle bird ascended into the air again. It flew over Southern Europe and into the Middle East, another 2,439 miles. The bird landed its big wings in Kuwait, and we boarded tour buses headed for a city made of plastic tents in the Kuwaiti desert. The city itself is a strange growth in the desert landscape. It looks like it has been there for years, but it also looks like it could vanish if a strong enough sandstorm came along. A walk through the white sand streets reveals strange facsimiles of American Burger Kings and coffee shops. Small shacks selling new cars and travel packages crowd the fast food restaurants and trinket shops. Though it's an American military base, most employees at the fast food joints and barbershops are Indian men, not the Kuwaiti people who own the desert. Our stay would be brief. Dressed in tan uniforms, we attended classes and briefs about cultural sensitivity and life on the Kuwaiti base. In less than a week, we would be loaded onto a military C-130 and strapped in for a flight into a combat zone. The flight would be less than an hour to another city made of plastic tents, this one reinforced with concrete barriers. People were a little more serious on this base than the last, but not much. They were the plastic facades of American businesses here as well. A poorly constructed subway sold sandwiches that in no way lived up to the land of milk and honey's moniker. More briefs, more cultural sensitivity classes. They threw in some IED preparedness training as well. The main sentiment of the PowerPoint presentation being that every piece of trash in the city could explode, and of course the streets would be covered in trash. As I sat in the plastic tent, it became apparent that our soon-to-be area of operation was currently the deadliest in Iraq. The takeaway from this particular PowerPoint on enemy activity was that it would get worse before it got better. We prowled the base in unsullied tan uniforms. I alternated between feeling like an excited child on vacation and like a man on death row, punished for a crime I hadn't yet committed. I watched with fascination as the other men in tan uniforms spent their final moments in quasi-civilization. Some tried having a bowl of ice cream before they ventured out into the wilderness. Others frantically rode home, already telling war stories to the pretty girls who waited for them. Some watched war movies, hoping that they could learn something from Colonel Kurtz before they traveled into their own heart of darkness. A few read. There were copies of On Killing by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman making their rounds. There were even a few of the classics floating around. The Sun Also Rises hovered above a Marine on a green cot. The novel seemed like it belonged. There were many who could be found at the gym, one last chance to get a proper pump in. More than a few of the men in tan uniforms stared off at nothing, worrying about what was at the other end of the impending helicopter ride. The helicopter came in the all-consuming darkness of the desert night. I shielded my eyes from the sand and pebbles that were kicked up from the CH-53's massive propellers. War was no longer an impending fate. It was now a current reality. All of us raced with our gear to the lower rear door of the helicopter. The grit of desert sand coated my teeth as I shuffled up the rear hatch, carrying hundreds of pounds of gear. I found my seat and collapsed into it. All our collective gear sat in the middle of the helicopter, all our lives packed into 2 sea bags and an LB pack. The stack of gear was just low enough so that I could see the faces of the Marines seated on the other side of the helicopter. I stared at their faces as the crew chief inspected the loaded gear and secured the rear hatch. There was a red glow from the cargo lights inside the helicopter. When I had imagined going to war, I imagined hard men with grim faces, staring through space and time, anticipating and making calculations for the fighting to come. I imagined the weathered jawlines of Tom Berenger or the stoic face of R. Lee Ermey. I don't know why I didn't imagine this. The red light reflecting off the smooth faces of teenage boys, most of us barely 19, some younger. We were kids, barely old enough to vote. Only a handful of us had any war experience, but that was in Afghanistan, which may well have been Mars for all the good it would do us here. I hope I didn't look that young sitting there in full body armor. I wanted to look menacing, but I suspected that my baby face glistened just like the rest. The helicopter rose into the pitch black. Once we left view of Al Asad Air Base, the landscape was shrouded in total darkness. We could have been flying over the ocean and I wouldn't have known the difference. The stinging scent of fuel filled my nostrils. I looked to my left to see an older staff sergeant sleeping, his head hanging forward, swinging to the rhythm of the helicopter's movement. Maybe he already knew what was waiting for us and decided to try and dream of home. I couldn't stop myself from picturing what was waiting below. The CH-53 banked hard and swung over a few flashing red lights in the darkness. Every time the helicopter banked, I could see the 4 small red lights blinking. The helicopter's circles got smaller and smaller until it leveled out and came to rest on top of the Haditha Dam. As soon as the rear hatch was dropped, the non-commissioned officers screamed at us to unload the helicopter. They weren't screaming at us in anger. Screaming is just the way Marines communicate. We formed a human chain and began unloading the packs and gear. In silence, we toiled as NCOs walked up and down the human chain, hurrying our actions along with verbal commands interspersed with profanity. Finally, the helicopter was unloaded. I knelt next to a uniform stack of green sea bags, resting a hand on the bottom row. I let out a sharp breath as I felt a knee dig deep into my side just below my tan flak jacket, which scared me more than it hurt me. I stood and spun in anger, ready to fight. Immediately, my eyes were drawn to the collage of chevrons and rockers that hung heavily from the bald man's collar. He outranked me by about 1,000 years of hard service. He struck the center of my flak jacket with an open palm and knocked me backwards. How about standing in a position of attention, you disrespectful little fuck? I thought about tackling him into the concrete just to see what would happen. Or maybe I could come up with a smart ass quip to make him feel like an idiot. But then I saw the bags they were loading onto the helicopter we'd just gotten off. The long black bags carrying bodies. Their contents looked small and diminished, but still human. I snapped to attention and stood staring at the bags as others carefully hoisted them up the rear ramp. I knew that 7 months ago, the Marines in those black bags had walked down the very same ramp I just had. I later learned that they were on their last convoy to the dam, but an IED swallowed them whole. As I stood there and gave a salute, cold sweat beaded on my forehead. The fallen Marines, meanwhile, began their journey back to moms and dads who would never smile again without feeling the pain of a phantom's knife digging deep into their bellies. I had seen a version of this before. It was an echo of the opening scene from Platoon. The major difference, though, was that this scene atop the Haditha Dam was actually fucking happening to me. I had to live through all the cutscenes and backstage production. I didn't get to bitch about the catering or renegotiate my contract for a better air conditioner. This was reality. I could no longer hide in stories of human triumph and defeat. I had to step into the unknown and hope my character came close to matching my heroes on the silver screen and written word. But as I've come to realize, nothing ever turns out quite like the movies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kacy. And now we'll hear from Leyna. Leyna Krow is the author of the short story collection, I'm Fine, But You Appear to Be Sinking, which was published by Featherproof Books in 2017, and the forthcoming novel, Fire Season, which will be published this summer by Viking. Leyna is a graduate of Eastern's MFA program in creative writing and lives in Spokane with her husband and 2 children. Please welcome Leyna.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks, Luke. It's good to be here, and thank you so much for that, Kacy. It was really wonderful. I'm going to read a section from my new novel, Fire Season. The novel is set in Spokane in 1889, the year of the Great Fire that decimated downtown, and it tells the story of 3 people who used that fire to sort of reinvent themselves, for better or for worse. The section I'm going to read is actually sort of an aside. It takes place about 30 years later and is sort of a tangential character situation, but it sort of stands alone nicely, and so it feels nice to read out loud, because you get sort of a whole little tiny story arc. But it's not really from the meat of the story, as it were. In 1920, Eastern Washington received a visit from its first barnstormer. A man who went by the name Trap Erickson flew his biplane in loop-the-loops, upside down and high overhead, only to swoop down fast. This show took place on a farm just outside the town of Sinkhole, to the amazement of the local folks who had gathered in the fields. After the show, Trap shook hands and signed autographs. He was a good-natured guy, generous with his time, and more than happy to spend the afternoon chatting up the people who came to see him. One young woman in particular caught his eye, and he had hoped she might ask for an autograph, or maybe even a kiss. It was not uncommon for women to want to kiss him after shows, a request he gladly obliged, regardless of their age or appearance. But this young woman, one he would genuinely like to have kissed, made no such askance. She stood apart from the rest of the crowd, a girl of 10 or 12 at her side. Trap kept stealing glances until finally the young woman said something to the girl, took her by the hand, and both turned to leave. "That's all right," Trap said to himself. "Something tells me I'll see her again." And he was right, he would. The woman's name was Susan Edgings McLaughlin. She was 22 and newly married to her childhood sweetheart, Thomas McLaughlin. They lived and worked together on a wheat farm with Thomas's parents and his younger sister, the girl Susan had been with for the barnstorming. Susan loved Thomas and his family. Unfortunately, since starting her life with them, she'd been beset by melancholy. She did not know what to make of her unhappiness. But when she saw an ad for Trap's show, she felt the woolen blanket of her depression lift slightly. She asked the older McLaughlins if she might have some money to take her sister-in-law, an impish tomboy who would certainly love to see a flying show. They agreed, and the youngster had indeed enjoyed Trap's tricks. But it was Susan who felt herself truly moved. "Do you think you could ever do something like that?" Susan asked her sister-in-law on the way home. "Sure," said the girl. "Sure, I could fly like that. Maybe I'll learn when I'm older. More fun than driving a tractor, that's for certain." "I think I could too," Susan said. This remark must have struck the girl as odd. Susan was not the daredevil type. She did not even care for galloping her horse. But the girl was too immense in her own imagination to give it much thought, her arms spread wide to form wings as she walked in a zigzaggy fashion. "Perhaps your arms ought to go back, not to the sides," Susan said, but the girl did not heed her, and why should she? That night, when the rest of the family had gone to sleep, Susan snuck out to the fields. She reached her arms back as she had suggested to her sister-in-law. Then she started to walk. No need to run. She did not feel running was required. She sensed in her arms a certain pull upward. She struggled to keep them behind her, straight and strong. Then the pull extended to the rest of her body. It lifted her from the ground into the cool night air. Just a quick flight, Susan thought as she circled the McLaughlin property. Nothing fancy, but she couldn't help herself. She dipped and looped. She corkscrewed and barrel rolled. She returned to the farmhouse smiling, and the joy stayed with her throughout the day. The family, so surprised to see her happy, did not dare question the change. Thomas kissed her on the lips in front of everyone while his sister giggled. Susan continued to fly at night, but the thrill did not last. She wondered if real barnstormers like Trap Erickson also felt the excitement of their trade fade over time. Some months later, Susan's little sister-in-law came to her with a page torn from a newspaper. Trap Erickson was coming back for another show, this time with 2 other pilots. A real flying circus, the girl said. Can we go? Susan assured her they could. This show was bigger, and in addition to Trap, there was Anders Ehrmeyer, a World War I flying ace, and Shelley Gunn, who garnered interest for being a woman pilot, and a good-looking one at that. The crowd was 3 times larger as well. Susan hadn't been planning to do anything, only to go and watch like before. But almost as soon as she took her seat, she felt she could not keep it. Her arms compelled her. Susan, who is normally very reserved and eschewing of all public attention, thought to herself, I guess this is happening, and found she didn't mind. Gunn had just finished her flight, and Trap was on the makeshift runway when Susan took flight. It was a beautiful and startling thing, this woman with long hair and a beige dress and boots suddenly zipping above the crowd. Many present assumed it part of the show, a trick involving wires. There were whistles and catcalls. But as Susan went higher, the sounds of encouragement faded. There was no trick, and people didn't like it. That bitch is really flying, one man shouted. Only Susan's sister-in-law continued to clap and cheer, her and Trap Erickson. Susan, sensing her performance may not have been well received, did not return to the show. Instead, she landed in a field 2 farms over. Then, when the rest of the audience had left, she walked back to collect her young charge. Trap was waiting for her as well. Fly with us again sometime, he asked, and Susan blushed. I mean it, the whole team loved what you did. This was untrue. Gunn had dismissed Susan as some bored housewife looking for attention. Ehrmeyer had been defecating in a goat trough and missed the whole thing. It didn't matter. Trap was the most popular member of the troupe and the big draw for the audiences, so what he said was law. Trap & Co. had 3 more shows in Eastern Washington before they left for a tour of the Midwest. Susan joined them for these as local talent. Trap kept her original place in the lineup, right between Gunn and himself. The announcer introduced her as the Flying Mother, though she had no children. A real hometown girl, he'd shout. She can cook your bacon, then fly off with your pig. Susan was unclear what any of that meant, but she relished her role in the show right from the start. And with the announcer's booming approval and a hug from Trap in front of everyone once she'd landed, the crowds were more committed in their support of her now. They whooped and crowed. People she had known from school called to her by name, but she pretended not to hear. The thrill was back, same as the first night, alone in the field. When the 3 shows were over, Trap implored her to follow them to Kansas. He made it clear his interest was not in her talents alone. What's that husband of yours got I don't? He asked. He took her rebuff well. He had never overstepped her boundaries when they were performing together and vowed not to do so now that they were through either. Susan was loyal to Thomas and to his parents. She told herself she'd had her fun. It was time to return to her life. But her old life would not allow her to return. She found her relationship with both Thomas and the older McLaughlins measurably cooled. There were no words spoken on the matter of her flying. They had not attended any of her shows, and now that it was done, a pall seemed to hang over the household. And in town, people pointed and whispered. These were the same people who had called her name during the shows. Susan could not understand it. By winter of that year, the narrative surrounding Susan had become unkind. She thinks she can fly, people started to say. Poor dear. She always seemed so bright, so normal. The trouble reached a head one December night when, leaving a Grange meeting with the McLaughlins, Susan was tripped by another woman. The act was clearly deliberate. What's the meaning of this? She asked. I knew you couldn't fly, the woman said. That proves it. If you could fly, you would have done it now to avoid falling. That makes no sense, Susan said. She tried to offer something else, but by then the men were already fighting. Thomas and the woman's husband grappling on the dirt floor. Oh, if it will end all this, Susan said to no one in particular. She put her arms behind her and lifted off. Everyone stopped to watch. They were still watching when a police officer who had been summoned when the fight first began arrived. Thomas and the other man were arrested, as well as Susan, all for disturbing the peace. Thomas and his fight mate were released the next morning with stern warnings against public brawling. Susan, however, was further detained until a psychiatrist could be found to make an examination. When the man arrived, he concluded her delusional and likely a threat to her own safety. At her sanity hearing, community members testified that they had heard Susan make claims that she could fly, but had never seen her fly themselves, of course. When in fact, the truth was just the opposite. Susan never spoke of her talent, but everyone in town had seen her do it. Mr. and Mrs. McLaughlin did not come to her rescue, nor her beloved Thomas. Susan spent the remainder of her life at Eastern Washington State Hospital for the Insane, too dismayed even to soar to freedom. She died at the age of 44 of pneumonia. She had few visitors in her years at the asylum. Trapp would have come, but he had no idea that anything of the kind had happened to her. Her most consistent guest left no record in the visitor log, as she never set foot in the building. Instead, she buzzed by Susan's window, a flying girl who over the years turned to a flying woman, never to be caught or shamed or maligned by anyone. She was too good, too fast. She flew as her sister-in-law had once suggested she do, with arms stretched behind. I'll stop there. Thanks, you guys.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Leyna, and thanks, Kacy, both of you for sharing your work. So Luke and I wanted to facilitate just a little Q&A with both of you today. I wanted to start with a pretty general question for both of you, just so that we could get a little bit of insight into your journey as writers. So first, what made you decide to study creative writing in school? So for Kacy, that's getting your bachelor's. For Leyna, that's going into the MFA program. What was your general plan for yourself as a writer when you made that choice? And how close has your actual journey been to that original plan? So whoever wants to kind of go first is welcome to.
Leyna, you want to take it first?
Sure. I was just trying to remember, I was like, how did I get here? What happened prior to this moment? Yeah, so I was working in journalism after I finished my undergrad for a number of years, and finding myself strikingly bad at it. And I felt like I knew that I wanted to write, and I had always enjoyed writing fiction, and I wanted to continue writing in some capacity, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. And it was actually my mom who encouraged me to go to grad school. You know, I was saying, like, if I could do anything, it would be to write fiction, to write stories, to write novels, but I don't know how to make that into a career. And my mom was like, you can go to school for that. And really encouraged me to, I think that's my mom's solution to everything, actually, is more school. So she really encouraged me to apply for MFA programs, and I wound up at EWU, which was really a wonderful experience for me. And it did, I felt like, help me focus on my craft in a way that was really useful, and put me in touch with people who ultimately wound up moving my career forward. And so I don't know what sort of my vision was when I started school. I don't remember, I think that, like, if I was being honest, I was like, yeah, I'm gonna go be a short story writer and a novelist, but that, only works out for so many people. So I don't know that I was, if I was being level-headed about it or not, but I feel really fortunate for the way that it has turned out. And I feel like going to EWU was a huge part of that.
Yeah, so I got out of the Marines in 2009, and I had the GI Bill that I figured after going through Iraq and the Marine Corps, I was like, I want to go to school for something for myself. I don't want just some job. I'm like, I want something that actually means something to me. And I'd always been a reader and somewhat of a writer, and I just was looking through a list of courses at Eastern. I was like, hey, creative writing, that sounds fun. And then it wasn't until I got into the first creative writing class with Rachel Tour that I was like, okay, this is fantastic. And I feel incredibly fortunate that I ran into her when I did. It just was, every now and then you meet the person you're supposed to meet at the right time in your life, and she was that for me. But as far as like how I thought it was going to turn out, obviously thought I was going to write a book immediately and it was going to be a wild success and I would just live off of that for the rest of my life. Apparently that's not how writing works, you know? So my book, from when I first started school, I was just I would go take a semester or a quarter here, a quarter there. I was still working, I had a family. So the first chapter in the book, from start to finish, I think I worked on this thing for like 10 years. So I realized that, okay, if you actually want to write something that's worth anything, it takes so much more work than you think it does. And I'm just happy anybody who's reading it these days, that's what I'm happiest about.
Awesome. Thank you guys both for those answers. Speaking of your time in the program and everything and being at Eastern, were there any writers that you read and were, potentially assigned, or writers that were brought to your attention through other students or anything like that, that, during that time in your life, inspired your craft, maybe changed, the way that you wrote in one way or another, that you maybe now still return to for inspiration or craft moves or anything like that? So any writers that kind of have helped shape you, over the years?
I'll let you start for this one, Kacy.
All right. Yeah, perfect. Well, yeah, definitely. So Rachel gave me a copy of The Things They Carried, which, is, one of the great war memoirs of all. It's not really a war memoir. It's like this kind of half fiction, half telling the true story thing he's got going on there. But as far as like something to return to, I read that book, once every year or two, and I pick up something new every time I read it, just down to the, the nitty gritty sentence structure, how he uses, even commas, and the way he uses lists, incorporates those things. That book was the first one I read where I was like, wow, a war story can actually be beautiful also. It doesn't have to just be this, macabre, depressing thing. There can be beauty in it too. And that was a huge inspiration for me. And she also turned me on to Joan Didion, who's, someone I read all the time too. I always go back to her. All of those new people like Truman Capote and Cold Blood, all those things like that. I should probably branch out and read more stuff, but I'm constantly going back to those books and rereading them and trying to steal more stuff from them.
Yeah, for me, Greg Spatz, who was my advisor, sort of right away recommended like Kelly Link and Amy Bender. He was like, you're writing strange stories. Here's some other women who do this. And they've been huge influences for me. Amy Bender in particular does this thing where she just starts her stories by saying what's strange in them. And I found that like really, it was like a revelation. Like you don't have to back into the world that you're setting. You can just say, this is what's happening, and you go from there. So I felt like those like really sort of opened up this world of like fantastical women writers for me in a way that was super helpful for sure.
Awesome. So just thinking about workshop, I know that there were always memorable moments, things that I'll always remember from workshops that I was a part of. Do either of you have memorable moments from workshop, either positive or negative, that still stick with you today? And if you don't have a particular thing that you remember, do you have advice for new writers on navigating the experience of a workshop and getting feedback from other writers?
Man, I just have like the fear of workshop that sticks in my head of like you bring in a story and being like, is it good, or are they just gonna tear this apart? And nobody ever tears it apart. People want to be supportive, they want to be kind. I'm teaching my first grad workshop this quarter. I just started on Tuesday. And I hope it's gonna go well.
That's awesome.
Like, do I have any advice? We're gonna find out, aren't we? We'll see.
Congrats. Yeah, I'm sure it'll go great.
Yeah, so I had two of my chapters of my book were workshopped at Get Lit workshops, so that was pretty cool. So Lisa Tilly workshopped a piece, and so did Sean Vestal, and those were great experiences because those are both more like one-on-one workshops, which was really cool for me. But the group thing, I I think the one thing is to like, don't forget your story and your intentions and why you did something. And there's people that aren't going to be able to see what you were trying to do. And so don't just like take all their advice and try to completely like have some confidence in yourself and be like, I did this intentionally. And I got some great advice one time that if you don't like something, it's possible that you just didn't understand it. And so that's something I've clung to. Like, you might not like it, but this was what I was trying to do. Obviously, you got to take the feedback, and you just got to be honest with yourself, because you know when you actually suck and when you screwed something up. That happens all the time too. But then you know your strong points and you know what you're going to hold on to in your story.
Great, thank you. So both of you guys, entered, the writing program here at Eastern, and Kacy, it sounded like you really had your book, kind of in mind. But both, you walk away with your the amount of work that you've produced while in the program, and then there's the process of, after school, after having that one-on-one oversight, whether it's thesis advisor or with Rachel. And so, what did that work, kind of look like in terms of, now school's over and getting it to the finish line? And then, Leyna, for you, how has that process maybe changed here in book 2, having been through the process before with your collection?
Yeah, so for me, like I said, I had little bits and pieces that I'd worked on in school, little chapters here and there. And I ended up getting a job with the railroad as a train conductor. So I was away all the time. So I was away from my family. I'd normally take the train from Spokane up to Canada. And then I would be in a hotel room for 3 or 4 days by myself. And I would just lock myself in there. Originally I just told myself, I'm going to just scrap everything and start over. I'm going to tell the story from A, all the way to Z. And then once I get there, I'll be able to chop it up and move it. And so that whole process was, that was probably 2 years of, writing on the railroad when I did that. And then no one had told me that for nonfiction books, you're supposed to write a book proposal first. So that came as a shock to me. I was like, oh, I did this in reverse. I guess you're supposed to sell the book first before you actually write it. So Rachel didn't tell me that. She probably should have, but she helped me write a book proposal. And so that was a whole separate, like, depressing thing. I was like, oh, no, I have to write this other. It ended up being like a 55-page document. And then I had a couple couple agents that wanted to represent me. They're like, this is great. And then they both had, I started to think I was cursed because they both had like family issues and both got out of the business. And so that was just like one setback after another. And then I randomly just saw Leyta books on the submittable page. And I was like, hey, the Leyta, that runs right behind my house. Maybe I'll submit to them too. And then just started working with John Gotch there, and everything worked out. It's a little pressed, but it's been going pretty well for us.
Kacy, can I ask how, in the course of that time, like how different the final product of your book feels from how you had originally envisioned it when you first started the project?
I wildly overwrote, so like the biggest thing for me was like, I think the end product here is like right around 90,000 words or something. I had written like 120 some thousand. So just like chopping it up, I had to come to grips with there were certain parts that were just boring. They're interesting to me, and they helped me tell the story when I first did it. But I was like, okay, people don't want to read this. This isn't really moving the story along. So just like, I guess it was much more condensed than I thought it was going to be when I first started.
I always think it's interesting, like I similarly have like spent 5 years writing a novel, but when we have these big lengths of time that elapse, and how we get from like, I have this idea of what it's going to be like, and here's where it ended up.
Mm-hmm. You probably did better than me, but like nothing ever lived up to how I had it in my mind. Like I had this perfect thing in my head, and I was never able to quite bring it to bear like I wanted to. You get it as close as you can, but the spark you have in your head never kind of lives up to what actually ends up on the page. But you try hard. But
now it is perfect because it's a book and you can't undo it, and people don't know that it was ever supposed to be any different.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna start using that one. Yeah.
I forgot what the original question was, so I went a different direction.
I was just curious in for you taking your thesis and how that then progressed to the actual short story collection that you had, and then how that process has maybe changed here for book two. I mean, one, there's the short story collection versus the novel, and then having been through the process before, anything that's maybe changed in there, versus what you kind of like we're saying, starting with to that finish line.
Yeah, for sure. My first collection was half of it had been my graduate thesis, and then sort of adding to it until it felt like a collection. And I was fortunate enough to have it published by Featherproof Books. The editor is a graduate of the MFA program as well, and that's how I knew him. And so it was this really nice little bit of nepotism to end up getting to publish with his press. And so, so much of that book had, the hands of everybody who was in workshop with me, and my advisor, Greg, and then Jason, my editor at Featherproof. And it felt like, really this thing that had been shaped over the course of my MFA experience and then the years right after, but still with the help of folks involved with the MFA. And then the novel was a very different experience. First and foremost, I didn't know how to write a novel. I definitely learned as I was going, and it was a slog, and went through a lot of rounds of revision, both with I was part of a writing workshop group that was super helpful. I got feedback from them. I got feedback from other writer friends, and then revisions just based on what I knew needed to change on my own. And then I ultimately, once I was able to get an agent, went through another 2 rounds of revision on it with her and then with the publisher. And so it felt like more, once I hit that stage of working with people who were sort of professionals, and I could say, okay, well, these people are professionals, and so we're clearly headed in at least the right direction. But up until that point, it felt I felt like I was driving in the dark for a long, long time with the novel. And that's not to say that I didn't have help and didn't have insight from wonderful readers, but just because I haven't done that process before, it felt very, very different. Whereas with the short stories, even though I'd never written a collection before, I'd been writing short stories for a long time and studying that and talking about it at school, and then to move into this new form did feel it was a pretty different experience. I like to think that now I'm like, now I know how to write a novel, but I'm pretty sure I still don't, and it would be the same thing again.
I have a question off that. So when you were writing this, did you start and try to tell the story from point to point, or did you chop it up and have certain scenes that you started to write and then kind of strung the story with the scenes?
Yeah, so I actually originally envisioned it as a novella. It wound up, the novel in its final form is sort of a 3-act structure with 3 different characters. And I had envisioned it just as the first character. When I got through that, I was like, this isn't satisfying, and wound up adding to it. But I am kind of a jump around writer. I will write scenes that are interesting to me and then go back and connect them. And I found that is, for me, not a productive way to write. I wind up, it's so hard to get that connective thread, but it is what I want to do, because I want to write what's fun first, right? Or the stuff that's on the top of my head. Are you asking because you do that too, Kacy?
I've only written one book, but I had to start at A to B and just tell the story. But I definitely was pushing, sometimes I would push myself too hard to get to the point that I wanted to write, and I missed stuff, so I'd have to go back and fill in gaps. Just impatient.
Yeah, I feel that. An impatient writing style. Same.
So just thinking a little more about influences on your work, are there some writers who you have learned about since graduating from Eastern, who you love and you love their work, and you really wish that you would have known about them or learned about their work when you were earlier in your career?
Well, I certainly can't come anywhere close to mimicking or anything, but I hadn't really discovered Cormac McCarthy prior to school. And then I just fell in love with there's a few books that I do read every single year, And The Road by Cormac McCarthy is something I read every single year. And it's another one of those that every year I read it, I'm finding something new. And it's another one too, where like the last 20 pages, it just makes me sob every time I read it. I've read the book, I don't know, 5 or 6 times so far now, and it just gets me every single time. And you know, you find when you read a lot of a certain author, you find yourself trying to like, you're inadvertently like, they'll just like wind up in your prose when you're writing. You're like, hey, that's not me, that's actually Cormac McCarthy. So you got to try to like push it out and make it your own again. But his is like, I'm obsessed with him now, and I read him all the time.
Oh man, yeah, Cormac McCarthy voice, like that's hard to, you gotta like.
There's only one guy.
Yeah, but yeah, it'll get in there. You know when you're doing Cormac McCarthy voice. Sure. For me, I think Miriam Towes and Elizabeth McCracken have become big time favorites of mine. And again, you know, in sort of learning how to write a novel, I think that I wish that I had had more models to look to begin with, which is a weird thing to say because I've read a ton of novels over my life. It's not like, oh, gosh, somebody should have given Leyna a novel to read, but to think seriously about those women's craft. And now that they're people who I return to over and over again to see how they're doing what they're doing.
What would be maybe the best quote type of advice that you guys received while in the program? You know, maybe this is, you know, longer than a quote, but, you know, kind of that one piece of advice that really stuck with you over the years, kind of rings in your head, maybe today as you're still writing.
I felt like there was kind of an ethos for the program when I was there that nobody really said out loud, or maybe they did, but it was something along the lines of, you know, like work hard and don't brag about it. It's not a show-offy group, and I think that's sort of stuck with me. Of like you put your head down and you do the work and you accomplish what you're going to accomplish, and you don't need to toot your own horn a lot. I think it's a good way to live as a writer. If we're always broadcasting ourselves, we're inevitably going to disappoint ourselves, I think.
Yeah, Rachel gave me some advice. I'm pretty sure she stole it from Hemingway, but it's the first draft of anything is shit, you know. And yeah, when I first started, like the first big project I worked on is I wrote a novel. And that was like never showed anybody other than my wife. And I wrote the first draft. And when I got done, I was like, I've just written the great American novel, you know? And then I came back to it like a month later. I was like, I can't ever let anyone read this. This is the biggest pile of crap I've ever seen in my entire life. And this needs to be burnt. And so just the realization that this, you know, just to echo you too, Leyna, is just like the amount of work and the amount of effort that it takes to actually write something worth reading. Like there's no shortcuts whatsoever.
Great, thank you guys. So one question here on craft a little bit that Kacy, your work today made me think of a little bit, and Leyna, having read your short story collection, just thought that maybe kind of played into both of you guys' writing a little bit. And so there are moments, you know, particularly with Kacy today, that you would drop in kind of a lighter tone, almost like a unfiltered consciousness, so to say, that, you know, I really noticed standing out and differentiating itself from the seriousness of, you know, the topic and what is being discussed in your narrative there. And so I'm curious, you know, how do you guys go about balancing some of those more serious subject matters with some of your natural voice that comes in and some of those lighter moments? You know, I know Leyna, in some of your stories in the short story collection, there's moments that are, you know, very humorous and funny, but there's also moments that are, you know, on the much more serious side as well. And so just kind of that overall balance of being able to talk about serious subject matter, but also have that, you know, more lighter tone being dropped in.
Yeah, for me, you know, I've read just about everything there is to read that came out of Iraq and Afghanistan too. And the one thing I noticed was, and the one thing that always caught my eye when I was reading is that everyone like forgot the humor, and you know, and grunts, like when you're not actually fighting, the only thing you're trying to do is make the other person laugh, so that is always missing from most of these like war memoirs, is that it's either like horror or hilarity. Like those are the two things, boredom and hilarity. So I was like, I really have to like try and show that, as horrible or as whatever the experience is, like you can't escape the humorous moments. I mean, those happen simultaneously with all the other things. So I just would, I think it also gives the reader a breath, because you're just dealing with all this horrible stuff all the time, and it becomes too much, and you have to give those little pressure release valves in there. Otherwise, I mean, people probably aren't going to, finish it.
Yeah, I sort of echo that. Like, humor is how we get through, no matter what the content is, right? And as a reader, I so much appreciate that, particularly when we're dealing with weighty topics, like, I mean, a war memoir. I would struggle to read something that wasn't imbued with some amount of humor. So as a reader, I always appreciate it, and as a writer, I just like to be funny. Like, I think that's the fun part for me, is I want to be funny, and it's a way to access more serious topics as well. Is, if you can be playful, and then you can open a door through which you can pivot to something that's a little bit harder to talk about. And it's a way of I think, leading characters into something with empathy, or leading characters into something with empathy, is like to show humor and then the hard stuff. Because sometimes if we just drop the hard stuff on readers, they can't actually get there in terms of empathy if they haven't had the experience themselves. They're just like, oh, this is just nope, can't go there, and they shut down. So a lot of reasons to be funny, but more than anything, I just want to be funny.
I think it's like one of the hardest things to do too, is to be funny on the page. Like, it's difficult. I definitely fail more than I'm actually funny, but it's hard to do. Like, anytime a book actually makes you laugh out loud, that's always impressive to me.
Yes, very impressive, for sure. So I just have one more question for you all, and it's just sort of to wrap things up today. So thank you again for being here and sharing your work and having a little chat with us. So I just want to know kind of what's next for the two of you. I know that obviously this is time to celebrate. You're, going to be promoting the new books. Kacy, I just saw that your book is now available as an audiobook, which is super exciting. So, I mean, there's a lot that I'm sure you're going to be doing to celebrate these new books, but what about what's next in terms of your writing? Are you thinking about that at all yet? Are you just kind of in the mode of, let's just focus on getting this book out into the world and celebrating it? Or have you already started writing something new? What's new on your writing horizons?
So I have a short story collection that'll come out tentatively next year with Viking as well. That my deadline for finishing that is October. So that's my focus. And I didn't know that my deadline was October until like last week. It was like casually like an aside in an email that I got from my editor. And I was like, all right, we have some work to do. So that's my current project for right now.
I've got to survive law school first, so I got another year and some change, and then pass the bar. But I've got about like 50,000 crappy words of a novel I've been working on. Most of them suck, but on my current pacing, I should be done with it in another 8 years or so.
Well, that's great. Like you were saying before, 50,000 words, even if you think that they're not good, it's better than zero. So
that's true.
That's really awesome. Yeah. So thank you all again. Thank you both again for being here. And thanks, Luke, also for being here and helping with the Q&A. So for everyone who is watching at home, I just want to say, if you want to learn more about these writers, please visit getlitfestival.org to find out more about Kacy and Leyna and more about other events that we have going on throughout the festival. We also have another event, an in-person event featuring Kacy this Sunday at 2 o'clock at the Montvale Event Center. So definitely check that out and check out our full schedule for all of the rest of the events that we have coming up for the festival. Tonight, we actually have an evening of queer poetry featuring Chen Chen. Tomorrow kicks off our weekend events at the Montvale Event Center. And we also hope that you'll join us on Saturday night for our headlining event with Brandon Hobson and Leslie Neka Arima. So again, you can find out how to purchase tickets and join us for all of those events and more at getlitfestival.org. Thanks again, everybody. Goodbye.